The theory of this conversation was that we wanted to not think of this conference as science over here and activists over here, but really to bring science and activism together in conversation. And so we have done that, I hope very well with our two speakers in this conversation. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, who is the founder and CEO of Ocean Collective. She's a marine biologist and has many other accomplishments that you can read about in the program. And Thanu Yakupitiyage, who has a very rich and deep CV in activism and is now the Associate Director of Communications for 350.org, but has also worked deeply and for a long time in immigration, immigrants' rights, and immigrant activism, and is also a DJ and has many other interdisciplinary talents. And so we've asked them to have a kind of open and broad conversation that draws together some of the themes that we've been talking about over the course of the conference, in the hopes that we can be energized by the intersections that they bring to the conversation. And I hope there will be some time for some back and forth with the audience, and then when we wrap the conversation at about 6:30, we have a reception outside because we like to keep you well-fed and hydrated and wined, and we can continue that conversation then as well. So I turn it over to our guests.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Hi, y'all. So it's been a long day, and
Oh,
perfect.
Hello. Yes.
It's been a long day, and so we were thinking that, sometimes you just need a little bit of energy. So if everyone just stand up real quick and just stretch, just get it out. And if you're in the back, come to the front. We want to end on a good note,
Oh, yeah, come up to the front and hang out with us. Just get cozy. It's a fireside chat vibe.
It's a fireside chat, exactly.
Is it working?
Yeah, no, I think so. I don't see anyone moving up, but you really
no
are
one
welcome.
ever moves up.
So thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here with you, Ayana. And
Likewise.
Thanks to Barnard for having us sort of end this day-long series of events. I'm going to start by just contextual. So we're going to be in a little bit of a conversation, and when Barnard asked me to do this, they asked, well, who's someone who you'd want to be in conversation with who, does work in science and activism? And I was like, Ayana, of course, who is a marine biologist and ecologist, and someone I've been watching from afar. And so just some context of my background. So I currently work for 350.org, which is an international climate organization that really focuses on stopping the fossil fuel industry and phasing out fossil fuels. As you know, there's about 100 companies, many of them are fossil fuel companies like Exxon, who have contributed to 70% of emissions. So that's a little bit about what I'm doing now. My background is in immigrant rights. For about 7 years, I worked for different immigrant rights organizations, and so I really bring, I moved into the climate movement fairly recently, about 3 years ago, in 2017 after Trump won, and I really wanted to bring more of an intersectional expertise into the climate movement. My previous experience in climate has been that it's a really white space. Sometimes it really still is, and I'm still sort of grappling with all of that.
This stage is not a terribly white space at the moment, though.
It isn't. This is a dope black and brown space right now, can we just say?
I mean, take your victories where you got them.
Right, exactly, hence this conversation.
Closing plenary, very brown.
Yeah, and I wanted to be in conversation with you, Ayana, because of my background. So I'm from an island. I'm from Sri Lanka. I grew up by the oceans. My father is an aquaculture expert. I grew up on fishery farms and in mangroves, and that's really my background in sort of environmental justice as a child, and then I sort of shifted into migrant rights and have now come back into climate. And so I'm really curious about your own background, sort of how you came to doing marine biology. And I think particularly on this question of these are two women of color on stage, and we clearly care about climate, but one of the things that has been kind of frustrating for me in the climate movement is this assumption that people of color don't care about climate. And I would love for you to talk about your own trajectory and how you sort of came to thinking about your work in relation to the broader climate justice movement.
Yeah. Well, I'll spoil the punchline, which is like, I care a lot. And how I got here, I also have an island story, because I'm from Brooklyn, and New York is an archipelago, and we often forget that, but New York has 578 miles of coastline, if you look at all the ins and outs, and all of the 36 or so islands that make up New York City. Of course, I didn't think about that growing up in Fort Greene before brownstones cost $40 million. Actually, $40,000 for a brownstone in the 70s and $4 million now. Let me not add zeros in the wrong places. It's bad enough as it is. So I grew up in Brooklyn, but it was going to Florida and learning to swim and being on a glass bottom boat and going to the aquarium and holding a sea urchin in my hand and feeling its tube feet on my palm. And I was just like, there are all these amazing aliens underwater, and I want to be friends with all of them, and this is my job now. And so I asked my mom, like, is there a name for that job? And from then on, I was like, I'm going to be a marine biologist. And of course, like, as a black kid growing up in Fort Greene, back when that was like a very, very dangerous neighborhood your friends were not allowed to come to for play dates, like, everyone laughed at my dream, which, just because I'm stubborn, I was like, well, now I'm definitely gonna do this. But my dad was Jamaican, and so my relationship with the ocean was always like the Caribbean. Just like you have Sri Lanka, I had the Caribbean, but I also had the stories of how much it had fallen apart since he was a kid. And so my motivation went from like this wonder at nature to, oh gosh, this is all threatened. What can I do to help? And that was even before we started thinking about climate. That was just overfishing and pollution and habitat destruction. So once you add climate on top of all of that, it takes just a very different approach and strategy to try to think about that. And anyone who lives on an island can see all of this happening. You're close to all of it, right? You see the color of the water change to a different blue. You see the corals lose their color. You see the fish leaving. I mean, fish are now leaving for the poles because it's too hot in the tropics, right? And all the food security implications of that. So my motivation has always been people, like the science, my scientific sort of curiosity. I think everyone is born with that. But the reason that I've kept doing this work is absolutely because it's a justice issue. Like, who gets access to the shoreline? Who gets to eat healthy food? Who gets clean water? Who gets beaches that are terribly polluted? Who gets pummeled by storms? Yeah. And so when people say that Black folks don't care about environmental issues or climate, I'm like, which Black folks are you talking to?
Right.
Because sure, there's people of every skin color who don't really care and prioritize these issues, but when you do national surveys, people of color care more than their white counterparts about climate. They're more supportive of environmental policy. They're more concerned about water quality and air quality. And it's because they're the ones living near the power plants. They're the ones in the fields dealing with the pesticides. They're the ones drinking polluted water. So, I think, not that the data is helping to convince anyone, but this sort of myth of the white dude environmentalist with a Prius and a Patagonia, like looking off into the distance, like that's just not the average environmentalist.
And it's kind of a ridiculous question, right? Because this assumption that like we all live in these silos where like climate is just siloed out from all of these issues. And like when I talk about this, I'm like, because people are always like, well, Thanu, like how do we get migrant rights groups involved? And I'm like, are you involved in their issues? Are you involved in stopping people from deportations? Like it actually is nuanced and complicated. Like for example, when I think about the migrant crisis and folks from different parts of Central America and what's happening at the border, that actually is part of the climate crisis, right? And then when people are like, well, we just need to get folks involved in like climate activism, I'm like, they are actively like fleeing a climate crisis. And like, you can't ask someone who is, actively trying to keep their family together to like go to a protest. Like it's complicated, right? Not everybody can get arrested at a climate march. I can't get arrested. I am not a US citizen. And so like, I feel like for me, when we talk about climate, like, it is about people and it's also nuanced. Like when we think about Hurricane Sandy, right? Like all of the shorelines, like Red Hook, for example, it was mainly communities of color who were impacted. And yet I feel like—
And a lot of housing projects around the whole country are built at sea level and at risk of flooding.
Yeah.
So when we think about New York City being at risk, the thing that we don't talk about nearly enough is sea level rise. Sea level might rise 1 to 3 meters by 2100. So think of that, because
That's
not all going to
globally.
happen at the end. Like, think about potentially a foot a year more water in New York. Sorry, a foot a decade more water in New York. Every decade for the rest of this century. Like, we're completely unprepared for that. And New York is actually more on it than most other cities.
Right.
And so my mix of like being a Brooklyn native and being a marine biologist and being worried about climate and being a policy nerd, those are like the 4 main things you need to know about me, is like I'm really concerned about how we adapt to sea level rise, because 1/3 of Americans live in coastal cities, 40% live in coastal counties, and we're just totally unprepared.
Mm-hmm. And this actually gets into a question I have around like your work, and you have the Urban Ocean Lab, which is one of your ventures, and you've been doing all this work on mitigation, coastal planning. Like, what is your vision for coastal cities? Like, when we think about like a sustainable future, and particularly when we think about the fact that like the most vulnerable people, mainly Black, Brown, Indigenous folks, are at the front lines, right? They're in New York. It's those folks who are going to have to move, and like in a city like New York where prices are rising, where do they go? Like, what is your vision for a sustainable future in coastal cities?
So this may seem like a cop-out, but like I don't have the answer to that.
I was like, tell us, Ayana, just tell us the solution.
So I'm gonna sort of like weave my way there, but so Urban Ocean Lab, as you mentioned, it's this nonprofit think tank that I'm founding with a designer who runs a design firm in New York, and a woman who worked on environmental policy in DC for over 2 decades on Capitol Hill. So between the 3 of us, we have this very interesting complementary set of expertise. And the question is, how can we envision and design the future that we collectively want for coastal cities? And then how do we create the policy framework that we need to get there? So I think often think tanks start with like a bunch of, Ivy League people in a room making up laws they think should exist in a vacuum. I get to say whatever I want about the Ivy League because I went there. There's a bunch of out-of-touch people there, and myself included, and I had to like re-educate myself after I got out of college. And so the question is like, if you're going to communities for solutions instead of making them up in a vacuum and then thinking about how to iterate around those proposals and design policies that enable that, I think that's more of the approach we need to take. So the reason I don't have the answer to what the future looks like is because I haven't talked to enough people in communities who have a lot of good ideas about how they would like to see this transition happen. So I worked in the Caribbean for a lot of years with fishing communities in Curacao, Bonaire, and Barbuda, and Antigua, and Montserrat. And I interviewed almost every fisherman on all of those islands. And my favorite question to ask was, if you could write the laws to manage the ocean, what would they be? They had great fucking ideas, right? Like, why don't we just like ask the people closest to the problem? And so I'm not right now the closest to these sort of transformational moments that are happening. So the reason I don't have the answer is because I need to listen a lot more first. But I mean, the big question is like, does New York City need to look more like Venice, Italy? What does managed retreat look like when we just stop rebuilding after hurricanes in the same place when we know it's going to happen again? And then sort of like, how do we keep communities intact? Because people are so culturally tied to physical places. How do we move people but keep community cohesion? How do we maintain culture in a very shifting world? How do we collectively mourn what we're losing? Because it's going underwater and everything is changing, and if we skip that step, it's not going to work.
Yeah, and I think what you're speaking about, like listening, like I feel like I'm in the same place, like I don't have the answers, and I think that sort of takes me to this question around like inclusion, right? Like, what does it mean to include people in a movement, right? And what does it mean actually to like be listening, to be thinking about climate solutions is like rooted in those communities. And so like, when you think about what it would take to build a multiracial movement that actually is like local solutions oriented, what are some thoughts that you have? Sorry, I keep asking these like very large.
No, this is these are the questions, right? Like, what does the future look like? How do we make sure everyone gets to be a part of it? I think, so as like a fast-talking, thinking type A person, the answer is really, really frustrating, which is move at the speed of inclusion, which I hate, because like we think we know the answers. Like we've read Drawdown, and we know that there are like 100 climate solutions, and all we need to do is just implement them faster. But there's obviously a lot more to it, right? Like, how do we make sure that communities get the benefit of the transition to solar, and that money is being retained locally? How do we make sure that the jobs, people have training for those jobs in this new clean energy economy? How do we make sure that people can afford to transition off of natural gas in their homes and fuel in their cars? So I think the short answer is I don't know, but I know that if you look around the room and everyone looks like you, you're doing it wrong. But I guess I would ask the same question to you, because I'm outside of all these organizations, right? I kind of just like try to be helpful where I can, and I'm doing a lot of sort of like weirdly independent communication stuff, but you are part of this movement building and part of telling the story of that movement. So maybe you probably have a better answer to that than I do.
Yeah, I think
Or
about this a lot.
or some horror stories.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I work at a very large organization that was started by a professor, an amazing man named Bill McKibben, and 6 students. They were all white, and this organization is really going through a transformation. And I came into that world really knowing what I was taking on, and I was quite culture shocked, because I'd come from doing immigrant rights work. It was much more diverse. And I've learned a lot. Like I think at the same time as like 350 is doing all of this work on stopping pipelines and really thinking about like cutting off the head to the snake, like stopping where like the money that's going into building these pipelines and what really that means. I also think that I have been doing my communications and policy work around more of a solutions-oriented frame, because I think like we need to phase out fossil fuels. Like when I think about like, I really try to do all of the work that I do from this like perspective of like, what is the world that we want to see, right? Like what is, like, if we say we want to see a world like where there are no pipelines, where we are on we have a Green New Deal and there's renewable energy, like what actually is it going to take to do that? And that requires like really nuanced communications, because like, as someone, like when I think about myself even 5 years ago, I wouldn't necessarily be convinced by a Green New Deal. I'd be like, what do you mean? What's in it for me? Or like, what's in it for like my communities? Like what's in it for Black and brown people who were, devastated by this hurricane? Like how are we actually redistributing resources beyond just stopping the money to the fossil fuel industry? Like what does it mean to redistribute the trillions of dollars that these white men have accumulated over centuries in this like capitalist like society and a colonialist society, and like actually redistribute that to the communities that need them? And I think about it also in terms of a global frame. And this is one of the real benefits of working at an international organization. So for example, my colleagues who live in Fiji and Tuvalu, like they're actively on the front lines of the climate crisis. Like literally the water, like if the water rises 10 meters, people's houses will be destroyed. And so they're really thinking
probably
about,
10 inches there.
Yeah, I mean like, and so I feel like actually looking, I was hearing this in some of the other panels, like really looking back at the cultural traditions that we're rooted in, right? It's not that, these policy experts have to come in and like suddenly provide new solutions. Those solutions already exist.
So I was reading about this morning. I'm gonna possibly get the number wrong. There was an article in the New York Times in the last week or so that there are 50 different Native American tribes who have been doing the research and analysis to create adaptation plans for their communities, for their reservations, drawing on, generations of knowledge about what a place has been and how the seasons and species have changed and interrelated, cataloging the changes, and working with scientists to predict what the future might hold, and then figure out how they can adapt to it and continue to live in those places. So once again, we're having Native people sort of show us the way, leading by example, creating these science-based and oral history-based concrete plans for how to adapt to a changing climate. And the question is at what point do we realize that we need to listen to all of our elders much more closely? So there's so much great work going on at the local level, which is important given the state of our federal government. And that's the thing that encourages me, is seeing how many people are figuring out their own solutions and not waiting for anyone to step in, because there is no savior, right? At all levels, there's this opportunity for everyone to figure out how their skills map onto solutions. So that's why I'm founding this think tank for coastal cities, because that's at the nexus of the things that I know the most about and care the most about. And everyone else has a separate thing. And so after listening to all of these amazing remarks all day, I hope for those of you who are looking for new ways to engage, you sort of do your own power map of what are your skills, what are your resources, who do you know, what levers can you pull to make changes that are bigger than yourself? Because if we keep beating ourselves up about I drove instead of taking a bike, or I went on a vacation, we're never gonna get anywhere, because we don't have enough alternatives now. We actually have to change the system.
Right, and that actually goes towards this idea of systemic change, right? And something I wanted to ask you, I feel like a lot of questions I get at some of these panels is well, what can I do? The sort of the individual change, and a lot of people are oh, well, stop using plastic. Of course, we have to absolutely, I'm for plastic bans and all of that. But when we think about the systemic level of change, how do you think that we all collectively contribute to that?
Yeah. When people ask me, what can I do? I want to help. I'm well, maybe consider that that's the wrong question. The question is maybe, what can we do together? There are so many organizations, yours and others, that have chapters all around the country. There are so many great local organizations here in New York doing this work, and I don't think that what we necessarily need is an infinitely large number of leaders, but we all need to be joining together in different permutations to figure out, sort of how we can collaborate. When you have a crisis looming, you can't just do your own thing in the corner and expect that to solve the problem, right? You're just going to be alone when it all goes wrong. And so I feel it's this moment in history when a lot of people are moving home. I moved back here to see how I could help Brooklyn. A lot of my friends are moving back to the Midwest or wherever their towns that they're from. And I think that's a really beautiful trend, to go back to the place that reestablish your connections to the land, and then see how you can build community around solutions. That's after 3 years of sort of doing a bunch of consulting projects and trying to figure out what was the next thing I wanted to do and really sink my teeth into, that became my mantra, that building community around solutions is the most important thing. And it still leaves so much open. Which solution? There are so many. Which community? There are so many, right? And how do you want to build? What role do you want to play in that building? And so that's the frame through which I think of how I want to spend my time.
Yeah. I wanted to address the title of this talk was When This House Caught on Fire, Everybody Was Home. And that reminded me of what that Swedish climate activist, Greta Thunberg, said. Sorry, you can tell I have some feelings about youth of color not being also considered. With all due respect, Greta said this thing, I want you to act as if your house is on fire. Because it is. Do you think that people are motivated by fear?
I think it depends on the person. I think this conversation we've been having in the climate world of like, are we motivated by fear or are we motivated by hope, is like this very absurd binary, right? And honestly, for me, it depends on the day. Sometimes I read something terrifying and I'm like, better get to work faster. Other times I'm like, I'm gonna dance around my living room to Beyonce for 2 hours and pretend that this doesn't exist, right? So and I think we need to allow ourselves to have a full spectrum of feelings about how dramatically the world is changing under our feet. And so I think that's why it's so important that we have a really diverse chorus of voices and talking about this issue, not just diverse in terms of race, but also geography and age and area of expertise and communication styles, right? Like some people, like speaking versus writing versus video versus art and music. I think we need to have this be a way that we talk about the world that we live in and the future that we want and how we're gonna get there, where there's a place for everyone to be a part of it, where everyone feels welcome, because this is an all hands on deck moment. And so when I think of fear, I'm like, if you need to read David Wallace Wells to get motivated, like, I'm glad he wrote that article, I'm glad the uninhabitable earth exists. I haven't read it yet because I'm like already sort of like doing all I can, and I feel like that would freak me out. I'll read it eventually, but like, I'm glad that exists for the people for whom that's motivating. I find sort of my motivation more in, honestly, heartache. Like, so much of this is about losing the things that we love and the places that we love and our relationships to the mangroves and the parrotfish and the seahorses and whales that live in New York Harbor, right? Like, that all these things are going to be changing. And I think, like, maybe it's a little bit masochistic, but it's like that heartache that keeps me going, because like, I don't think we get to give up. I think that comes from a position of privilege. People who are like, well, it's all going to hell in a handbasket. Like, nothing we can do. And I'm like, who are you to give up on the entire planet and all of humanity? Like, do you have a trust fund that you would like to share with us, So I think there's this opportunity to have just every kind of way of talking about this. And as a DJ and someone who thinks about communication and the role of art, I'd love to hear you share, like, how are we doing so far? Like, what are the opportunities for bringing a broader spectrum of ways to engage on this through the arts in particular into this work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm motivated by joy. Like, I really am. I think that so much of, I'm involved in all of these like different parts of my life. I do this cultural organizing, I DJ, I'm involved in immigrant rights. Like, and when people are like, well, why do you do all of this? I'm like, because when I do climate work, when I do migrant rights work, I need to know what I'm fighting for. And for me, just like the small things, whether it's like bringing joy to a group of people on a dance floor, like, that is worth it. Like, that's when you see like what the world could possibly be. And I have the privilege of being part of like queer communities of color in Brooklyn who, for me, are my motivation of actually what the world could look like if we actually addressed racial justice, if we actually addressed migrant justice and climate and really did that together, So when I think about something like a Green New Deal, which is something I want to fight for, like, I think about like, what are the kinds of transformations we want for ourselves in this life, right? And in this world. Like, I recently became a godparent, and I have this like, my godchild's name is Mika, and I'm like, damn, like, I really want a secure and like amazing world for you, And I think that sometimes
I have a new goddaughter too.
Oh, congratulations.
And it's a crazy motivation because she calls me Auntie Fish. And she like learned how to make a fish face, and she like FaceTimes me and makes her fish face. She's just turned 2, and I'm like, I really gotta save the fish for this kid. She's never even seen one in the ocean yet. Like, ugh.
I hope my god kid calls me Club Auntie.
Yes. I mean, we concede this.
Right.
Yeah. So do you feel like the climate movement, climate justice, has really had a cultural strategy? Or do you see that starting to come together?
Well, when I think about how I started to get more interested in the US climate movement, it actually was the 2014 People's Climate March, and shout out to some people in the room, like Leslie, who was very involved in the People's Climate Marches. I think that what drew me to those initial marches was the art. Like, it straight up was the art. I was like, like under some like balloon thing, like, I was just like running around like a kid in these marches, and it was some of the most like joyous marches I had been a part of. And for me, coming from the immigrant rights movement, like I think there is a lot of fear when you do migrant rights work because you're constantly like, trying to protect people and stop something. And so it was kind of interesting to see this other take on something, that what it means to actually do something based on like arts and culture. I think that the climate movement is getting there. I think that where it's limited right now is that cultural strategy just isn't like a pretty poster, right? Cultural strategy has to be something that goes through an entire movement. You have to actually think about, again, it's about like what kind of world you want. And so like when I think about like climate policy, migration policy, we need to think about like what is the cultural strategy that helps us get there. A good friend of mine named Sonia Gwinansaka, who's a migrant poet, she often talks about how the way we shift people is first we shift culture, then we change policy. And I think that that's where we're at right now. We're shifting culture, and the fact that more and more people are interested in climate and doing it in their different ways, that is a cultural shift. And I feel like it's exciting to be part of that with you in those cultural shifts.
I worry that we're not being deliberate enough about the cultural strategy, right? Because when we think about the gay rights movement, and we think about like all of the sitcoms and talk shows and all these ways in which Americans were exposed to like, don't worry, it's going to be fine if we give gay people rights too. Right. And it became just something that was just wherever you looked in culture, in music, in TV, in film, in the news. And I feel like there's a strategy to make that happen. It's deliberate, right? So I have a friend, Fabiana Rodriguez, who's created this organization called Cultural Power, which is about deliberately building these relationships with Hollywood, with artists, between artists and activists. And America Ferrera is doing the same thing with her group Harness, bringing artists and activists together to sort of cross-pollinate. And I think we need so much more of that, right? Because one of the most interesting things that happened at the climate strike in New York, where I last saw you in September, was that Jaden and Willow Smith performed.
That was my idea.
Thank you for that. Also, did you choose the DJ?
Yeah, duh.
The DJ was so good. I was like, can you DJ my 40th birthday party? Can I have your card? And that matters. Like Afrobeats at a climate rally, I was so excited. But when Jaden Smith came off stage, I don't know why I was the one there. He was like, this was the best show I've ever done. This felt like so useful. I want to do more stuff like this. So we have a whole generation, multiple generations of people who have these large platforms, who have a way to engage audiences, who really want to be helpful. And so I think the next wave of this work is helping to connect those dots in really powerful ways so that climate becomes something that is routinely acknowledged as our context, the way that things are changing, as opposed to like, now we're doing a climate episode of whatever. It's just like it was 65 degrees in Antarctica this week.
Yeah.
It was 30 degrees hotter in Antarctica than it was in New York. Like 2019 for me will be the year that talking about the weather stopped being small talk. Like it happened for me longer ago, but it was the year that like everyone kind of looked at me with like fear in their eyes when we talked about like this rain is supposed to be snow. Right. And so I feel like part of this work is like 1 million conversations a day so that we can get over the fear and kind of, at least as far as it's stopping people from doing something, and it just becomes like, okay, well this is our crazy reality. We're all acknowledging it, and now we can just like figure out who's gonna do what.
Yeah, and also I think figure out like how we like help each other. And I really think a lot about intersectional storytelling and just sort of like intersectional work. And one of the things I've really been thinking about, obviously, is it's the border crisis and The fact that refugee policy in the US and actually in many parts of the world, they don't acknowledge climate refugees. So if you are at the border and you say, well, I need to come into the US because, my home was destroyed, or like there's a food security shortage, or, I don't have a farm anymore, that is not a grounds to come into the US.
There was a boat of like 30 or so Bahamians who tried to come to Florida after
and they
the
were
last
rejected.
big hurricane, and we turned them away.
Mm-hmm. And I think, so it's like these stories have really just enraged me, because it's also about like what happens when the most powerful countries and these companies like Exxon and Shell, all rooted in the West, like it's colonization in a different way. So now you've like destroyed the entire global South. All of these people are moving because they have no choice, and now you're shutting down borders. And so I spend a lot of time talking about how it's so important for these movements and the racial justice movement, for all of us to be really doing work together, because all of our issues are each other's issues, right? And so I'm really invested and really like call on people to really think about it that way, just because, it's like whatever small part of work you're doing, like really think about how it's connected to all of these other things.
So for you, coming out of the migrant justice work, what are the major lessons that you've been able to bring from that to climate work?
We talked about this question, and then I didn't really think about it.
She was like, this is a question you can ask me, and now somehow I've still stumped you.
Well, I mean, some of the lessons, I think just like cultural strategy is super important, and persistence. I think that the thing about the decade that I spent in the migrant rights movement, and I'm still a part of it, is that we knew that there was never going to be a point where we fully won, right? It's like everything is in evolution. And so, for example, when I think back to the fight for comprehensive immigration reform, and that stuff has really been tabled because of the Trump administration, because now it's just like this, panicked, like we have to help, like we have to stop people from getting deported conversation, which is also like a little bit complicated. Like even like comprehensive immigration reform wasn't nuanced enough. People were always going to be left out, right? And I think that particularly in this election year, when things like climate and immigration are some of the top issues in the US, like we actually need to like advocate for like the most visionary things. Like it's not enough to just be like, okay, well, like let's say the president, like please God, but like let's say the president changes, that we're like back to a comprehensive immigration reform conversation. We need to go beyond that. We need to talk about like, what does it mean to actually like rethink borders? What does it mean to actually think about climate solutions in a way that allows people to move across borders and to like, support their families? Like these are the levels of visionary conversations that we are not having because we're so limited by the politics of our time.
So the Green New Deal is very interesting in that context because it's the first time that we've actually had a vision laid out. And for those who haven't read the Green New Deal resolution, it's a resolution, not a bill. It's 13 pages long, double-spaced in very large font.
It really is.
It will take you 5 minutes to read it. Everyone's like, oh no, I haven't read it, it's too long. It's not too long. And I think that everyone should read it so we could actually have an informed conversation about what we like and what we don't like in it. And when I read it, everyone was like, it's too comprehensive. And I was like, it's not comprehensive enough because they mentioned the ocean once on page 11 and they're like, in a list of things we should maybe protect. And I was like, you guys, if we leave out the ocean, not only are we leaving out, the fact that the ocean has absorbed 93% of the heat that we've trapped, a third of the CO2 that we've emitted has been absorbed by the ocean, sea level rise, all of these things. The change in fisheries and ecosystems falling apart, those are just the bad things that are happening to the ocean. But coastal ecosystems, mangroves especially, but also seagrasses and wetlands and marshes can absorb 5 or 10 times more carbon than a forest on land. And yet all we're talking about is planting trees, right? We can have fully power, theoretically, America with offshore wind energy because wind blows so much stronger and more consistently offshore. And yet we're not really talking about offshore energy. And in fact, we're letting rich people complain about their views getting ruined stop us from doing wind development in America. We only have one tiny wind farm in the US because no one wants to see them and no one wants the transmissions lines coming onshore near their property. And so we have this opportunity also to think about how we farm the ocean, not in a way that we're farming big carnivorous fish that we have to catch wild fish to feed, but actually growing more seaweeds and oysters and mussels and clams in a way that absorbs tons and tons of CO2 and excess nutrients that are running downstream from industrial agriculture and actually is a part of the solution, right? And so I read the Green New Deal and I was like, we're gonna need a Blue New Deal.
And then there was a Blue New Deal.
And then I wrote one. Actually, the step in between is like I wrote an op-ed called The Big Blue Gap in the Green New Deal, which then became a policy memo that I co-authored with an ocean farmer named Brent Smith, who founded this amazing organization called Green Wave that does regenerative ocean farming. And then he asked a question during the CNN Climate Town Hall, which we had because activists insisted that we have some sort of debate, if not an official one, for the candidates on climate. And Brent Smith asked a question to Elizabeth Warren. He was like, what do you think about including the ocean? I feel like we need a Blue New Deal. And she was like, absolutely, that sounds right. So next thing you know, I'm like working with her policy team, and a month later, we released the Blue New Deal plan, which I hope no matter who is the candidate, the ideas in there can be carried forward, because we need to like be finding our solutions wherever they are found, right? And so that's what's exciting to me, is I do feel like we are finally in this mode of thinking bigger again on this stuff.
So I want to open it up to questions, but I wanted to end on one question to you. So it's 2020, they're calling it the climate decade. There's been all of these reports.
Who did this branding?
I don't know, I started calling it the climate decade. I don't know who else started. But you know, I mean, like the IPCC report in 2018 said that that was in 2018, said that we have 12 years to really turn things around. It's now 2 years later. There's been a slew of reports, right? There's like the emissions gap report, the production gap report, showing that like not only do we need to like limit warming, but also we're nowhere close to that. Actually, there's more fossil fuels being burnt than like ever before. And there was also an oceans report that came out last year. And so just my question, like given all of these like very, you know, sort of heartbreaking reports, what did you take away from that report, and what does that motivate you to work on this year and this decade? That might be too large.
There are no questions too large. So last September, the UN released a special report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, called Oceans and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate. And cryosphere just means all the ice on the planet, which is a word I learned last September. So I didn't read the whole thing. These things are hundreds of pages long, but they usually have a summary for policymakers up front that's like 40 pages. And so I read through that, but mostly I looked at, and the thing that really stuck out to me was how these UN scientists were really focused on the impacts on people and communities. So we're reaching this point where people aren't just talking about numbers, they're talking about what it means for people living on the coast and depending on seafood and all of these risks that people are being exposed to. So that was really heartening. But for whatever reason, I was reading this on the subway, so I'm like on the C train coming back to Brooklyn, and I'm just crying. And thank God it's New York, and like you can basically do whatever you want on the subway, and like nobody cares. So I'm like looking at these graphs, and I'm crying because I look at graphs and I know what that means. Like I know what those numbers mean for how many lives are at risk, how many people might be hungry, how many people might have to move, right? But the thing, like, got my act together. So I woke up the next morning and I looked at it again, and what you see is how much is still up to us. There's still a huge spectrum of possible futures, and we can't stop climate change. We can't go back in time. We can certainly stop emissions, and we can certainly stop making things worse. And so when I look at those graphs, they have all of their different scenarios, right? And there's a difference between like going up to 8 degrees of warming and staying at 2. There's a difference between like 2 feet of sea level rise and 2 meters of sea level rise. There's all these things that are such a huge, this is the x-axis, this is the y-axis, these are the, there's all these different ways in which these variables are still very much undecided where exactly we're going to land. And so as much as that report was heartbreaking and literally had me in tears, I was like, oh, we still get to decide a lot of what the future looks like. And I want to be part of, I know you're probably here because you want to be part of making sure it's not the worst case scenario, right? Like let's have the best case scenario.
Thank you. We're going to open up to questions. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. You have such great energy. It was great to hear you both speak. You both mentioned like cultural change and nuance, and one thing that worries me and a lot of critique that comes out of things like Green New Deal is it getting completely like co-opted, and how the language right now and even the rally on September 20th was basically like permitted by Cuomo that you could like take a day off school and that's okay, which just kind of defeats the purpose of a school walkout and walking out of work. So sustainability is like more and more, I feel like, getting co-opted. So what do you think, like what nuance and what needs to happen so that these big visions don't turn into just like a greenish capitalism?
Yeah. So first of all, the thing about
Very well said.
Yeah, about Cuomo and de Blasio, like actually mandating that people could leave school. Actually, I did think that was important because the problem that, like, what happens though when young kids skip school, it's usually the black and brown kids who get, like, the most in trouble. And so I did think it was really important that they allowed for kids to leave school because the consequences for black and brown youth were gonna be really, really extensive. So that's one thing. And I think we do have to, like, sometimes we gotta work with our government. It doesn't mean that it's less of a protest, right? It just means you're trying to keep people safe. It's the same thing in terms of like who can get arrested, who can't get arrested. Not everybody can put their lives on the line like that, and we really have to consider that. Do you have?
So on the nuance part of that, I think there's sort of two different versions of nuance.
Right.
There's the version of nuance which is like scientists preventing you from saying anything that people will understand because there's so many caveats that like they kill the message. Yeah. So there's like the level of nuance that we need in scientific reports, but is actually like very counterproductive in overall communication. And then there's the nuance that's we just need a lot more voices. We need a lot more perspectives. We need a lot more experiences being part of the being the most influential people in the room, right? Like for the past decade or so, there's been like 3 middle-aged white climate scientists and 2 or 3 white male journalists who are the thought leaders on climate. And many of them have done incredible work, and it will never be enough.
Yeah.
And so one of my projects right now is actually I'm co-editing with Catherine Wilkinson, who's vice president at Project Drawdown, an anthology of essays by women climate leaders. So 35 voices from lawyers to soil scientists to farmers to activists to policy nerds to energy policy people to people fighting coal to anything you can imagine, to people doing green buildings to landscape architects. And I think that's the kind of chorus that we need if we're actually gonna come up with good solutions. So it's not just that they're women, it's not just that they're mostly people of color, it's that they represent like such a massive diversity of the types of expertise and backgrounds that it's gonna take to come through this. And so a lot of the work that I do right now is actually trying to shine a light on the people doing the best work and making sure that they have the megaphone they need to just keep charging ahead.
Yeah, and on the watering down of the Green New Deal, like the Green New Deal we still get to make what the Green New Deal is, right? And so it really requires that we continue to push so it doesn't get watered down. So one of the things that I'm doing at 350 is making sure that the Green New Deal explicitly says that we have to phase out fossil fuels, that it has a plan for that, because right now it doesn't. And so that's really gonna take advocacy from all people to be like, we don't want just like a series of policies that don't make sense. And also the Green New Deal, it can be broad. It can be a whole set of policies that should also include
Everyone's
the
gonna
oceans.
go read it, right?
Yes, it's like a page. Other questions?
Hi, y'all. Thanks very much. This might be a slightly theoretical question, but I asked this as an anthropologist who sort of studies culture. And I hear over and over and over again in sort of climate spaces that we need culture change. And I guess I always just wonder sort of what does that mean with like kind of more granularity, I suppose? Like where does that come from? Is this an individual process? Is this like a top-down process? Like anthropologically, it's very interesting to me that we can sit and say like we need to fundamentally change how culture works. And I just have always wanted to ask this to like more people in the climate movement, sort of like what does that actually mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
No, thanks.
I mean, culture works at so many different levels, right? And so then it can feel really overwhelming. On like a fundamental level, when we talk about like climate spaces, I think about like cultural change is also like changing who is in the room. Like that to me is like a huge part of cultural change. Like I want to see more people that look like us, and I am seeing that more. But like it's like to get to that conversation around like, well, what does cultural strategy look like? We have to have different kinds of people in the room.
So the sort of examples that I gave around the gay rights movement were one version of that cultural strategy. But one of the things I've noticed now that we're in this era of the youth climate strikes is that like the main chant that you hear is, what do we want? Climate justice. When do we want it now? And that's because it's diverse young people leading those chants. Climate justice was never a rallying cry until like last year. And that's a major cultural shift. And so I think now that we have a 3-generation movement, we're gonna see a lot of this stuff. But I mean, I was talking to Varshini Prakash the other day, who's co-founder of Sunrise Movement and the current executive director, and she was saying like they're actively working on developing a cultural strategy right now. And I was like, give me like the dream, like how can I help? And she's like, well, I kind of want Lizzo and Chance the Rapper and Lil Nas X to all be singing about climate change.
And Lil Nas X is singing about climate change, actually.
He also like now has a Team Ocean jersey as of like the Super Bowl, which was like a partnership with Ocean Conservancy. So I don't think we're actually that far off. Like Jaden Smith coming off stage after singing a concert at a climate strike and being like, this is what I want to do more of. I mean, these are the moments that I should have been like, what's your email address? Where else do you want to perform? But I was just like enamored with his pink pearl choker necklace and kind of distracted. But I think there's this opportunity to have climate be part of the air we breathe. And that's what I mean when I say culture change, right? That it's not like this one moment where you go to this one thing and someone tells you about climate change, that it's just like, it's part of your daily life. Like, I have this pin that I wear on my winter coat that says, like, it looks like one of those road construction signs with the lights that spell out, like, slow down construction ahead or whatever, and it says, we are the asteroid. And my barista, it was like, what does that mean? I'm like, the dinosaurs went extinct because the asteroid were like, this time humans are gonna drive everything extinct. And he was like, that's really dark, it's only 8 a.m.
Yeah.
But like, I think we just need to have this be like a continual conversation so we can get over the fear and the like, what do we do to the doing of the things. Yeah. So that's maybe too vague of an answer, but hopefully there's like something in there
but
for you.
Just another point to add, like on these like youth climate activists, and Shea Batista actually spoke earlier today, shout out to Shea. It's also just like young people, like people talking about climate in different ways. Like Shea talks about indigeneity and being a migrant from Mexico, and climate, like talking about these things in more nuanced ways is part of a cultural shift.
So I want to go back to the question of culture shifts, and I'm wondering, when you say culture shifts, are you also including the global south? Because anytime there are powerful voices from the global south going to particular climate summits, United States plays a huge role in pulling them out last minute. And also, I don't know if anyone in this room So, knows about Sunita Narain, who's a very important voice in climate change from South Asia. She was literally yelled down by New York Times. I forgot who the journalist was. And so I'm wondering what climate activists from the United States or, more broadly global North are doing when these kinds of politics is unfolding, particularly around the question of overconsumption of the global North, and also the way the statistics or the way the calculations or the paradigms of quantitative analysis are being constructed so that the truth of the entire narrative, which goes back to imperialism, doesn't unfold. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. So one of the greatest joys of working where I do is that I work with people from the global South. Like, this is an organization where there are folks in South Asia, there are folks in the Pacific Islands, there's folks in parts of Africa, and I do think that there's a lot of work to be done around seeding space. The reality is that, like, the people who have had the least to do with the climate crisis are the most impacted, and the most impacted people are people from the global South, Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities all over the world. And so, to just speak to one part of your question, that actually really requires that we think about, like, our privileges in these spaces, and we think about, like, how we take up space. And one of the projects, this media project that I was involved in, was actually elevating the voices like in the media of young climate activists from the global South who were not getting as much attention as Greta Thunberg. Because there are young people in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Sri Lanka, in the Philippines, in Fiji, who are doing this work and really incredible work in their community. And I think elevating their voices is super important and part of what we need to be doing.
This is definitely not a helpful answer, but my current approach has been to focus on the US. I was doing all of my work in the Caribbean for almost a decade, and of course there are ways that we can be helpful in those contexts, but I was like, I gotta go home and I gotta fix the place that I'm from. I have to talk to my people, right? Because we are exponentially more so causing the problem. So while you are doing a lot of the work of building the connections, I'm coming back and I'm like, yo, Americans, like, get it together. We are exporting all of these climate problems globally and really putting a lot of people at risk. So my reaction to the situation you've described is sort of try to see how we can shift things here a bit.
Yeah, and
but the book that I'm writing and the think tank that I'm founding are both completely focused on the U.S. All the writers are from the U.S. For the think tank, we're focused on U.S. coastal cities, and that's because I feel like a big part of how we've gotten into this mess is because we've had storytelling that makes climate change always seem like it's happening somewhere else, right, to some poor person, to some people of color, somewhere else, and like, isn't that too bad for them? And as long as we keep letting that be the story, unfortunately, because of racism and classism and colonialism, as you mentioned, people are not motivated to become a part of the solution in the way that they need to be. So I'm really focused on talking about climate change impacts and climate solutions as an American problem so that we can sort of use that as a way to wake people up.
And both of those strategies, I think, are important because it's not useful for people living in the States to be like, let me tell you what you should be doing in the global South. I'm global South diaspora. I'm Sri Lankan. That's where, like, my roots are, but I also live here, and so I wouldn't ever tell a Sri Lankan climate activist what to do. I feel like that actually has to be, like, some way in which, like, we create solidarity.
I think we have one last question.
Oh, yes.
Hi. Okay. Hi, thank you. This is a nuts and bolts question. One of the criticisms I've heard about wind in energy or windmills in offshore is, this one quite doesn't make sense to me, but I'd love to have a real answer to it, that it will disrupt fish, wildlife swimming routes, and also that birds will fly into the propellers, like they
This is
fly-
Donald Trump's favorite talking point about wind energy, that
Yeah.
they'll kill too many birds.
Yeah, like,
Yeah.
well, right, so I would be really, as somebody
Yeah.
who doesn't have an intelligent response, that would be helpful.
No, this is a great question because we
and,
need to stop the false narratives around why we shouldn't put in place the solutions are really important to sort of deconstruct. And I went on CNBC a couple months ago and they just played a clip of Trump talking about how wind energy is terrible because it's killing all the birds. And they were like, what do you think about this? And I was like, totally taken aback because I was like, this is the conversation that we're having. And I gave some lame answer about like how, maybe we have to risk a few birds to save the planet. And the real answer is like, do you know how many, not just individual birds, but entire species burning fossil fuels is driving extinct? I mean, we've lost like 70% of our songbirds in the last 50 years. And so I think one way of considering this is to think of it not just as a cost, but as the cost-benefit analysis, right? Like, what is the risk of inaction? What is the risk of not putting these alternative energies in place? What is the cost to fish, to birds, if we stay on fossil fuels? It is much, much, much greater. Also, fish are incredibly smart. I know this from personal experience. They will find a way around. Birds also, have the ability to learn and shift their migratory paths, but we also have good enough science to not put these places in the flyover zones for birds when they're going north. Like, we know the routes of these things, and that's the beauty of having the ability to collect all this data, is that we can design around it. And so yeah, offshore wind, definitely a good thing, and the more the merrier.
And don't
And I
fall
was
for Trump's talking points.
Thinking about solar, and if you have any thoughts about them comparatively.
What,
Like, of course, there's always wind, right?
is there a
always
downside of
sun.
solar? Is that what you're asking?
I'm sorry.
Is there a downside of solar?
Or just,
So how does it
like,
compare?
Is wind, like putting up the windmills, is that cheaper than installing
So the answer-
solar or things like that?
So the answer is, we're in this moment where we need all of the above. We need all of the solutions and all of the solvers to really be a part of this. And so it depends where you are. Some places are windy, some places are sunny, some places are both. And I think we just need to be really thoughtful about how and where and when we're deploying all of these solutions. And it's more complicated than that too, right? Like, where are you getting the raw materials for making all these things? Are we mining the entire bottom of the ocean to do this? We don't need to do that, by the way. Are we making sure that communities get the benefit in the form of cooperatives around these different local energy production? I mean, there's a lot of nuance in how we deploy and scale up these things, but the absolute truth is that solar and wind are both way better than fossil fuels, and that's what we need to be. That's the direction we need to go.
And on that, we're going to end. And I'm just going to ask for everyone to take a collective breath with us, because this is a lot, and this is a long fight. So if you could just and let it go. It's all going to be okay, guys. I promise. Thank you. Thank you, Ayana. Thank you, Bernard.
Thank you.